Hello and welcome again to the Our Intellectual Dark Web podcast. Before I get into today's content, I need to do some housekeeping. So, some requests have been made in the past about expanding the podcast on other platforms besides YouTube, and we have done that by creating a SoundCloud profile. So, the first episode is uploaded there and is available for download. I know some folks want to be able to download the MP3 and not have to rely on listening it to YouTube. So that's something we have tried to address with that move. The YouTube channel still needs to be developed, so that's an item on the list we need to check off. And then, of course, we could probably expand it to other platforms as well, but for right now, we're going to focus on YouTube and SoundCloud. And if you want it on other platforms beyond those, just be sure to speak up. Now, on the topic of SoundCloud, if we upgrade our SoundCloud account, we can get more minutes and put more episodes on. Currently, we can only afford to put the first episode on there with the amount of minutes we've been allotted. So that's a challenge to overcome, and that's going to cost money. So we talked a lot about what to do with funding for the podcast. I mentioned in a post in the sub that we had wanted to do Patreon crowdfunding, but given their recent bans, notably of Sargon of Akkad, and then the response by several key members of the IDW to that, we ultimately decided as a community that the consensus seemed to be in the discussion for that post that we should not use Patreon. So we're not doing that. I've sent up a PayPal link. It'll be included in this video and in the post in the sub, and it's already been shared in a post in the sub that talks about the things I just discussed. I encourage you to go there and contribute so that we can upgrade the SoundCloud account and so that we can use these funds to develop the podcast more, clean it up, improve its presentability, and lay the groundwork so that it can continue to grow and hopefully become something serious and a good and successful community project. That doesn't happen unless people start to chip in. And it is a bit early, I think, in this process to be asking for contributions. I definitely wanted to wait before I got around to doing that. But given what happened with Patreon and given how much more convenient of a funding platform that is, that we are now not going to use, I figured that if we are going to use a less effective one, it might just be better to go ahead and start on that. So please contribute what you can. I understand that's going to vary from person to person, but if we could just get some people to donate about $10 each, that would help us meet some of these these short-term goals in improving the podcast and make it more accessible and available to other folks. And then maybe you can start to snowball from there. So that's the current state of the podcast. And as far as today's content goes, I had Gus Henebry on. He talked with us about the current politics within academia and the leftist leanings it has and how this is affecting, in many ways, the career prospects of people who dissent negatively. And we'll have a thorough discussion on that. But Gus was a wonderful guest, and like our previous guests, offered a trove of information and insight on his topic. So I'm very grateful that he was on today. I will go ahead and say that the first 10 minutes of the conversation are lost due to a major technical difficulty I encountered, and I am heartbroken at that. I really am upset. So this episode is going to start kind of in the middle of the conversation, and I ask you to put up with that as best you can, and I can assure you that I figured out why this issue happened, and it will not happen again. Very embarrassed by this, but otherwise I think this was a good conversation and a good episode, and I give full credit for that to Gus. And with that, I do give you Gus Henebry.
Converting enough souls to Christianity, etc.
Right.
Because I was raised Catholic. I was homeschooled my entire life. I think I spent 1 year in school, and so with that, I had not necessarily a limited worldview, but a very specific worldview growing up. And so there was a lot of a lot of following in the footsteps of others, a lot of doing things because, you know, they are right, not because I've been convinced that they are right, so to speak. And it's been very, you know, it was a little bit unsettling to me. The more as I grew older through high school and then getting into college, the more I came to realize that I only believe things because I was told to believe them, and not because I've critically kind of looked at all these things. So that drew me away from uh, the church for a little bit, not so much in that I rejected Catholicism, but I just grew a little bit skeptical and despairing almost of its rectitude. Um, which meant that when I got into grad school, when I was studying, when I started studying English, I went to a small private school and got a degree in classical philology. So I'd spent 4 years studying Latin and Greek and you know, the classical world, and it was very, very interesting. But it's a little bit difficult to market a bachelor's in classics these days if you're not ready to do the rigorous research-based life of an academic, which I quickly found out I was not very well, not necessarily cut out for, but not much inclined toward. So when I got into grad school and I started experiencing not only different, not necessarily just different viewpoints, but I started experiencing different entire lenses through which some people frame reality, it really started me on a period of intense exploration. I was going to church again, and it was a very good opportunity for me to really examine things further. But one of these things was trying to understand, okay, so what is the truth behind religion itself, that we can understand from history, that we can understand from different, you know, taking a more broad perspective, looking at Eastern religion, etc., and seeing how all these things have interacted and what the origin of these, you know, myths are, etc. And
I smell a lead up to Jordan Peterson here.
exactly. My little brother was living at home at the time, finishing up college himself and preparing to go into the Marines officer candidate school. And so he, because he kind of got bored with playing, you know, too much Overwatch on the computer, he started listening to podcasts instead of music during these things. And then all of a sudden he was only listening to podcasts, and he was subscribing to this guy named Jordan Peterson and this guy named Jocko Willink. And, you know, on top of some, you know, he was listening to Ben Shapiro and other folks at that time before all this kind of came together. But this Jordan Peterson guy, I was really, wow, this is something else. And there was a little bit of the Schadenfreude in his initial, you know, his initial videos talking about transgenderism and how this is anti-scientific and things. But as I grew more and more to, you know, watch his videos, read his book, my brother and I saw him in Chicago, you know, on the first American leg of his tour with Dave Rubin. It was incredibly eye-opening how deep the stories that I inherited from the Bible and from my upbringing, and that many other people have, how deeply set they are, not only in, of course, our history and our prehistory, but in our biology itself. And so it helped me kind of reconcile and understand, you know, or rather, I suppose, make a lot of connections between things that I grew up knowing and learning, and the different perspectives and ways to view the world that I encountered in grad school by studying literary, you know, critical, you know, literary theory, etc. And so, yeah, so I've just been, you know, eating up Jordan Peterson, you know, anything I can get for a long time. But then, of course, he was, you know, the gateway to Joe Rogan, to the Weinstein brothers, to, you know, my personal hero of, so to speak, of Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein, the beleaguered academic who's persecuted for his beliefs, and etc., the postmodern martyr, and things like this. So, and it's been so much. Well, it was a progression of having fun listening to Jordan Peterson argue against angry students, to an understanding that, wow, this is a very, very important movement that's pushing back against the rank relativism, against the manipulation and warping, and, you know, bluntly, gaming of the truth that we see all over the place these days. And hopefully, you know, my hope is that it will only pick up speed, and that things like this Patreon substitute will take off, and that Peterson's ideas of having a rigorous humanities-based online university will take off. It's there's a lot of, I think, hope for building a future, but and we can only hope that more people kind of are turned on to the rectitude of what these guys are doing, and not simply give in to low resolution, to uncharitable takedown pieces of Sam Harris versus Ben Affleck, or of Jordan Peterson being a darling of the alt-right, etc. I mean, there's so much wrongness in all of the criticism these guys get, not because, oh man, I'm an acolyte of these fellows and they can't do any wrong, but rather just that no one, it seems, other than people who are very, very closely following them, have taken the time to understand what they're saying.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Took you a while to mention Sam Harris there. I assume you're on Team Peterson and against Team Harris.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
It's a silly question, I think. It's just
it is, but let me put it this way. I grew up hearing names like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Hawking, like kind of whispered or in hushed tones of like these people who are trying to bring about the Antichrist or something. Of course, Barack Obama was in that group too. So whatever. But the thing is, suddenly I get into this IDW and I find this guy Sam Harris. I had no idea who Sam Harris was before.
He was one of the Four Horsemen. Before he was in the Intellectual Dark Web, he was one of the Four Horsemen. So he has the interesting position of being in both.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the fact that all of a sudden this rivalry came up between Peterson fans and Harris fans, like, friends, this is, for one thing, this is not the game we should be playing. Right. And for another thing, we need to understand that these differences can persist. There doesn't necessarily need to be a reconciliation, and that we're all doing the same right thing. None of these IDW people are observant religious people, really, save for Ben Shapiro, and even then, I'm still somewhat mystified as to why Ben Shapiro is included in this group anyway. I think it's just because he's willing to kind of be the conduit to these fellows, having Jordan Peterson on, etc., and to push back against to push back against the postmodern, the relativism, etc. But of course, the fact that he plays the daily right wing online like basically web series version of Rush Limbaugh for the millennials, etc., it's a little bit different compared to everyone else. But I suspect Ben is on a path. There's been from, say, as far back as even a few years ago, where he was just how to take down a liberal, kind of strawmanning intellectually dishonest Ben. And then there was Ben who has started talking with folks like Sam Harris, with folks like Dave Rubin and the other IDW members, and he's been more subdued and restrained and fair. And if you ever, I don't know if you ever heard this episode of the Sam Harris podcast, but he talked about how Ben Shapiro was critiquing an argument of Sam's. I don't quite remember what the argument was, but Sam reads it, and Ben has gotten what Sam actually he misunderstands what Sam actually believes. He is he has given Sam a position that Sam does not hold. So Sam emailed him, and Ben Shapiro was like, "Oh," he wrote back and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll fix it." And Sam basically said, "That doesn't happen with a lot of these left wing journalists. That they'll just dig in and they will fight to the death on something they know to be a mistake or an outright lie." And so I think that's the thing with Ben. So you've seen in the sub, there's been a lot of, even though some of the members seem to have more of a slightly right-wing leaning, there's been a lot of hesitance about Ben Shapiro compared to the other things. There was even that one poll done on a Google Doc recently. I don't remember who did it. It said, choose the IDW members with whom you most identify. Ones, right? We pretty much said all their names by now. Maybe Heather Hying was on there. We haven't mentioned her until just now, but Ben Shapiro was like at the bottom of that. Maybe Rubin was at the bottom, and then Ben Shapiro was the second lowest. So that's interesting. I really wonder, honestly, about I wonder what Ben's plans are for the future to fight against his, owning the libs, obliterate the leftists reputation. But
Mhm. Right, because that's a pretty big obstacle he raised for himself.
yeah, it's how he made his money,
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
and so how's he going to have a career doing basically the opposite of that, being charitable to liberals? Uh,
yeah.
as much as I complain about liberals, I know I have to be charitable to them. Like that's
Mhm.
the whole ethos. But anyway, we can talk more about the IDW. I think in the but I think it's time we moved along to you and your issues.
Mhm.
So I'd like you to just sort of tell me what your experiences are in academia right now as a graduate student, what you have observed, and how they pertain to a lot of the stuff that's being discussed in the intellectual dark web.
Certainly. Um, so one of the things that really resonated with me at first about Jordan Peterson were his comments about about academia, because in his earlier videos, before he really got started on the tours of the biblical lectures or psychological significance series, he was just distressed about what he was encountering as a member of the Western Academy. And I found it to resonate a lot with me. Now, some of it I believe was projection, and on my part, just saying, "Oh yeah, I'm as persecuted as this fellow is," which is certainly not the case. However, what astounded me when I got to graduate school, so I'm going to graduate school at a land grant university in the Midwest. So just a good old state-run, money from daddy government secular institution, and which is the exact opposite of everywhere I've either learned or I've worked. I was homeschooled my entire primary and secondary education. I went to a small, extremely rigorous, liberal arts focused, classical education based university. Then I taught for 2 years at different classical education schools. So we have this core tenet of you know of promoting Catholicism, etc., as something essential to the schools. And right now, I'm even doing online teaching in the same uh, in the same area, the same sector. And so when I got to a secular institution, it was very, very striking how much groupthink there really, really was. That was the first thing that really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very, I think it depends on universities. It depends, or it varies between universities, between departments in universities, etc. But I will say, the TLDR at first is that Jordan Peterson is largely correct about humanities departments, about the integrity of scholarly work there, about the worldview shared writ large implicitly amongst not just departments within a university, but between academics anywhere. You look at journal articles, you look at conference proceedings, you hear guest speakers, you listen to the questions, the guest speakers on campus, you listen to the questions posed by faculty members or kind of the faculty members' acolytes, posed to these guest speakers, and they're all kind of on the same page about this whole generally left-wing, postmodernist, the truth is really what you make it, because there is no absolute overarching truth, and it gives us plenty of justification to just pursue whatever, justification or really freedom to pursue whatever academic thing we'd like to pursue, and focus and convince employers that we can benefit their university by writing articles in this tiny little niche, and this tiny little niche of scholarship, and then have the ability to also teach classes. And the thing is, and none of this really manifests very, very openly, very obviously, very with any vitriol or any even passion behind it. It's simply an understanding amongst many, many people. And what I don't think, or what I find a lot of people criticizing Peterson for, is his language that, especially when he gets particularly manic, blaming or not necessarily blaming, but rather sounding conspiratorial or conspiracy theorist when talking about the postmodern influence in universities, saying that this is, saying that they postmodernism came about as a way to excuse or cover up professors' beliefs in Marxism in the 60s and 70s, and since then, it's if you listen to him and you're not very, very careful and listening to exactly what he's saying, it's very easy to get the impression that he believes that there is some kind of deep state, radical left wing social justice warrior kind of body that is that has its many spider-like fingers and touching all these different web strands at all these different universities to make sure that no one believes in God and no one believes in objective truth, and everyone just wants to smash the fashion, destroy the patriarchy, etc. Whereas my experience is not so much along those lines, and I think that if there's some criticism we can give toward Peterson, it's that the tone of a lot of these very strongly held stances of his, which I think are justified and based in absolute truth and absolute faithful representation of reality, the tone simply can be very easily misinterpreted. And tone policing is not a really good way to critique an argument, but I think it's just presenting low-hanging fruit, which is why Sam Harris I think has one up, if we want to rank these things, on Jordan Peterson, because he's always implacable. He is calm, he's collected, even when he's getting his ire up. He's still pretty calm. So the thing is, I don't believe that that the general left wing, single-minded, postmodern, etc. Nature of most humanities departments, but not just humanities departments. It's also in the STEM. It's also certainly in the administration, which is something we'll get to soon. This is not a deliberate move. It's simply a result of the ivory tower syndrome or phenomenon, that over time, because college was suddenly placed on a pedestal in Western society in the mid-20th century, you had this understanding that college was a bit of a black box, and that whatever happened there, you send your kids there, they're there for 4 years, whatever happened there, you don't really care. You don't care if they're partying, you don't care if they're, hooking up, doing drugs, whatever. It's just they go there, they learn, they come home at Christmas or summer sometimes, and you talk to things about, about things to the parents, and the parents don't really care, but they understand that now they're getting smart. And then after that, they have the degree, and the degree is their ticket to a job. And because that is simply, even today, the character that, or the way that most people approach college, things have gotten really, really rotten in the state of Denmark, and people are only now really becoming aware of it on the outside of the college, and people inside colleges, inside academia, are feeling very, very attacked because they say, I'm not trying to do this. And no one necessarily, except for a lot of activist professors, are trying to do this. It's just something that has happened, and there's a lot of disconnect with reality that these professors experience, and we have a few examples of them, realizing this. The Weinsteins. Is it Weinstein or Weinstein? I always get this.
It's Weinstein.
It's Weinstein. Thank God.
Weinstein is for the rapist. Weinstein is for the brave intellectual.
Right. Okay. Great. I've never gotten that straight in all these hours of
I'll develop a mnemonic device for you and for anyone listening. Okay.
Please.
Stein is fine. Steen is mean.
Eek. Oh. Okay. Yes. That can work for sure. Let's sticky that on the sub. But the Weinstein, but Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, who are kind of the ideal academics, really.
Oh yeah.
Understanding that all of a sudden something has happened in universities, and they, the ones who are most devoted to coaching students, especially those who can't learn in traditional manners, to become excellent minds and excellent contributors to society, they were ousted for completely false claims of racism and prejudice, is baffling. It's baffling to them. It's baffling to people who understand the situation, and it's baffling to other professors in other universities who say, "Oh, that's not us, though. We don't do that." So, there's a reticence to recognize this. It seems on a lot of professors, and some professors, when pushed, will say, "Well, yes, of course, that's what we're doing," and some people will say, "No, not at all. I will never punish someone, student, just for what they believe or for something that they say, in class or what. I will never give them a certain grade based on that. I will never, report them to disciplinary body for that." And yet, a lot of times, that's simply words, and actions tell a different story.
Okay. Well, that was very thorough. And so one thing I think I want to discuss is, so you've noticed that it's not necessarily this a very complex conspiracy. There's not a lot of, we'll say, hierarchical organization behind this postmodernist movement in the universities.
Right.
It's sort of fell into place. And I think if we can reuse an argument of Harris's, what he was talking about the 2016 election, and addressing some of his more right-wing fans' concerns about voter fraud by illegal immigrants, because Trump claimed that up to 3 million Mexicans here illegally voted in the election. Harris pointed out, do you know how hard it would be to get 3 million people like that to vote, to get away with it, not get caught, and then have none of them feel remorse or get cold feet and come clean?
Right. Or just get drunk at a bar and start running their mouth.
And he has said that about he's also said that about 9/11 being a conspiracy and not a terrorist attack.
Right.
I imagine the same also applies to what's happening in the universe. We're talking about what would amount to several thousand people across North America, at least, all of whom are just totally in line with this, and none of them, or there are internal feuds in things like this that could lead to one just letting the cat out of the bag to spite someone else in the hierarchy, even if it betrays the movement. These are things that bring down actual conspiracies. Actual conspiracies are hard.
And a lot of times they're boring too.
Right. Yeah, and that's another thing. It's not to say that they never happen, but to play sixth-dimensional chess with the world without error rarely happens. If you look at how much trouble it is if you look at the Obama administration and how hard it was for Obama to get what he wanted, or get what he wanted with Trump becoming the leader of the Republican Party, what kind of control do people have that they can hatch these mega conspiracies so flawlessly, and there's just they're churning out these conspiracies like an assembly line for 4chan and the other underground parts of the internet to discuss, right? So that's one thing that occurs to me. So I'm glad that we've cleared that up. But I think you're right that it probably just naturally occurred. It's one of those things where if we look at what maybe Brett or Heather would say about stuff, it's our evolutionary behavior kicking in. And then I think if we also look at mechanisms that explain things like the gender pay gap, we see that these sort of iniquities are the result, in some ways, natural tendencies allowing to be given their full course. So men are heavily overrepresented in STEM because men tend to have more of an interest in things, and so they're the ones who are super interested in things and therefore will be super productive employees in STEM are at the end of that male bell curve. So it's like a 90-10 difference often. And if STEM is in demand, which it is because we are now a technological society, advancing our science is everything. If you are behind technologically by just a year, that is a huge disadvantage to your profit margins. So that's just a fact of life, and it's not a conspiracy by men against women necessarily. Although there are probably some elements of sexism at work in some things, but for the most part, it's probably just this is what happened. So when I look at the universities and what happened there, it seems to me that in many ways of a political scholar gap or something where so Peterson, for example, has often discussed that liberals are more inclined toward the character trait of openness, whereas conservatives are not. Conservatives like to draw borders around things, and then conservatives are also more inclined toward disgust. So it seems to me that the natural tendency is that a lot of liberals would end up in universities over time, just naturally, and because research requires, like, to do bona fide research requires openness, and then it also, I think, requires you not to be disgusted at new ideas. So there's these at work. And I think what we have seen is just a natural tendency for liberals to pursue careers in universities. And what this has ended up producing is sort of a monolith in the universities in the long run. This emerged, where if you're not of that liberal persuasion, if you're conservative, or even if you're centrist, you're now part of the outgroup. And it's one of those things where they sort of, in a subtle, maybe unconscious way, the liberals realize their strength, their advantage. They realize they're the dominant group, and they're making use of that. So, do you understand what I'm saying? I wonder if I'm not communicating it well.
No, this is. I think that's entirely correct.
Okay,
that
so
over time, since the beginning of really the explosion of popular university attendance, simply a large sorting game has happened, and people who are more inclined to do the kind of intellectual activity involved in academia have gone to academia, and a lot of that implies, like you said, having this openness, this radical, really openness in perspective, and the willingness to consider other viewpoints. That does, tend to also correlate with people on the left. Whereas a lot of the, uber high performers on the right, if they did go to college, it was mostly vocation, for a vocation,
right.
To get this degree so they can get into a certain industry or whatnot. Yeah, and I think it is accurate to say that this has simply happened with very few people realizing what is going on, and because of the the popularity, the recent explosion in popularity of activist politics, all of these different factors have combined to characterize, and in some cases mischaracterize, the universities as something that they are not.
Right. And so it seems to me we can. I think we're going to have a pretty thorough discussion on what needs to be done to address this. But the very first thing that stands out to me is to apply Peterson's own rule to the situation, right? Clean up your room first, sort yourself out. Conservatives need to make greater efforts than they have historically to become part of Western academia. They need to, because what has happened. So the reason why we're seeing what we are now, because we talked about the liberal tendency toward openness, but we might agree that they don't seem very open lately. And I think that's just because and this is more of a structural thing. What ends up happening is when almost everyone at the university is liberal, you can't actually experience openness. You don't have challenging ideas.
Right.
And so even if you have a greater natural disposition toward openness, we're all still human beings. We're still also operating from this pro-social genome that's true of the vast majority of us. And at that point, groupthink can kick in and take over. I mean, Brett and Heather have often talked about how we have divergent cognitive mechanisms in our brains that we can turn on and off given the right situation. So for a long time, academia allowed liberals to turn on that mechanism for openness. But when time passed and the system became overwhelmingly liberal, we found ourselves in an ideologically homogenized situation for these universities. And then so at that point, it's no longer about openness. It's you have to fit in there. And and so while a lot of these people are sincere, in some of the postmodern stuff they advocate, I do have to wonder if some of it's just a result of them. You know, we have these automatic behaviors that push us toward being agreeable for our survival.
Right.
I'm vaguely reminded of. Yeah. Did you see the first episode of the podcast?
Yes.
All right. So Serene Desiree, our first guest, she talked about how there are these guys in Seattle who'll just agree with whatever she says. Right. Then they'll start out saying like feminist stuff to I guess because they assume since she's a woman, she'll like feminist stuff. And then when she has a dissenting view, they'll agree with that. Now, are they actively making decisions to lie? I got it. I think it's just they're much more likely to say, "Oh, I see your point of view," because in that moment they're trying to be pro-social.
Yeah, I mean, I heard that part of the podcast, and I was just thinking, well, it's a very small example. You know, it's a microcosm of rent-seeking behavior that simply characterizes, a productive, wealthy society that we have. I think that probably there are some, if you're talking to guys at bars, who come up to you and start being, obsequious from the get-go, as a way to score cheap points in the mating game. I think I would posit that probably some of them are just being yes men and just trying to to be sycophants in the pursuit of banal sexual pleasure later on that evening. But I think that you're right too, and I think that is really enabled by this pro-social behavior that you bring up. And but how this applies to academia, I think there are a few different things to bring up. So first off, you're right. There is obviously a tendency to avoid confrontation and to agree, and that tendency can be metastasized almost, or at least practiced to the point of metastasis when everybody agrees, as we've theorized happen in academia over the years. But there are some other things as well, because the thing is, even though you have the humanities as as its own little monolith, right? There's an enormous amount of variety within that, and there's an enormous amount of variety that is new to the humanities versus what was studied as humanities, as the liberal arts, for hundreds and hundreds of years before the 20th century. And so the fact that we have kind of further splintering of the humanities and introducing departments, or rather not just departments, but whole fields of study like anthropology, sociology. I mean, you could argue that women's studies, et cetera, but I want to get to that in a second. The thing is that diversified the field, yes, and it gave people more kind of specific ways to work toward what they want to focus on. But at the same time, it also drew more of these borders. And it meant that, and this greater specialization really started to have, I think, a negative effect on academia. And this is something I've picked up from a couple different academics I've been reading, and two or three different things have really happened in academia, from what I can tell. One of them is that at some point, and this is something that I teach to English 101 students as a TA, at some point there is a shift to viewing college not as a place to learn, right, as a place to kind of grow your own soul and develop yourself intellectually, morally, with regards to your character, but rather just an expensive ticket to a better future, to a way to improve your social class, a way to secure a higher median salary than you might otherwise be able to secure. There are statistics that show that people who have who go to college earn between $1 and $2 million more on average, kind of in all industries, than people who do not over this course of their lifetime. There's a large economic incentive to go to college even now. And that took over the focus. And so you had people going to college simply as a way, and not necessarily needing to engage with the ideas there, because they just wanted to get the degree and minimize their chances of getting kicked out, and so that way they can get a well-paying job when they graduate. So there was a utilitarian aspect to it. And it started, and the thing is, at some point in the West, particularly in America, North America, that became the dominant reason to go to college. And today it is the dominant reason to go to college. There was even, there's this scholar, Dan Barrett, who wrote in this essay, the day that the purpose of college changed, that really Ronald Reagan's administration, not as the president of the United States, but as the governor of California, was the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, in the national shift toward viewing education as a way to simply make money. He was notorious for defunding, for not defunding, but reducing the state funding for education. And in California, this state that had been built up a multi-tiered university system, state-run, government-funded university system, so that way everyone at all levels of intellect, all levels of intellectual ability, I should say, could go to college. They had, a bunch of community colleges. They had a bunch of technical schools, or at least more of the land-grant universities, throughout the university, the UC system. Then they had a lot of these, more Ivy League imitators, like Berkeley, like Caltech, etc. And so they had this lovely system that was suddenly, the funding for which was suddenly cut by Ronald Reagan, as justified by the idea to. Justified by the notion that, well, we shouldn't be funding people who just want to learn stuff. We should be funding people who will benefit the economy. So the vocationalism. Then, and this is where the diversification of humanities kind of comes into play. At the same time that was going on, you also had, just as a natural result, really, of academic research and academic work, the narrowing and the specializing of fields to the point where they were no longer mutually intelligible with other fields outside of or really with other scholars outside of their specialty. So if you had, for example, like I come to this from studying classics all my for really all my life, the history, the literature, the culture of the Greeks and Romans, right? That's what we kind of talk about as classics. You can say, well, yeah, the Persians are in there, etc. But the point is Greco-Roman stuff. But the thing is, classics departments really just got way too into understanding the tiny differences that happen in these like the uses of certain grammatical bits in long dead authors, and suddenly it was no longer relevant to a lot of other fields. And so the humanities kind of wrote itself into irrelevance. And when they write themselves into irrelevance, they basically limit their marketability to really only working in academia, which means that if you wanted which means when you combine that with this vocationalism that's on the rise in the mid to late 20th century, then you suddenly have a huge shift away from the humanities, because people want to go, have a 9-to-5 job, not have to worry about doing, all this intense research and intense scholarly work that really only very few people are cut out for. So we have basically this self-irrelevant, the entirety of the humanities field, as opposed to STEM or as opposed to law or medicine. Well, I guess, medicine's in STEM, but the point is, or rather medicine's the math. Anyway, the point is, you can tell I'm a humanities guy. I don't even know what STEM stands for. I have to think about it. The point is, humanities basically became unimportant. And it became unimportant because suddenly people did not share this mutual intelligibility between fields, to where suddenly only classics professors were only talking to classical professors. Women's and gender studies and queer theorists were only talking to people in their same field. English scholars were only talking to people in their same field. And so you had this great stagnation of thought diversity, of viewpoint diversity, which is one guy that I got turned on to very, very soon after Jordan Peterson was John Haidt. And his book, The righteous mind is an absolute, masterwork of why people, believe these things, believe things the way they do, and how, political opinions and religious opinions are all as a result of really personality, etc. And you see this really manifest very strongly in academia. And so what needs, and of course this happened again with people over a long periods of time throughout different, long series of academics' careers, and no one really noticed it until people started bringing it to light very recently with suddenly pointing out, wow, there's so much groupthink that if you say something outside of the accepted vocabulary or accepted, codex of beliefs, you are suddenly not just weird, but repulsive, and dangerous, and we need to silence you. And so, is this all being clear? I should check in.
Okay, so it seems to me that you're saying. So you're saying he. No. So it seems to me that you're saying the humanities really dug themselves a grave.
Yes.
And maybe they didn't realize it, but we realized it well past the point of critical mass, or
Yes.
the humanities realize it about themselves. And so part of what we're doing with this big postmodernist movement, this what you call the tendency toward activist politics in the universities, is in some ways a defense mechanism of the humanities to keep itself alive and relevant. So when it is observed by, let's say, so my state of North Carolina, we have our own major university system.
Right.
University of North Carolina is the oldest public university in the country. And then it has its sister schools in several different cities across the state. And it's been the pride of the state for a long time. Republicans.
Well, I mean, hey, you gave us Michael Jordan, so
yeah. So there's that. And there are other things, but the Republicans took over the government after the 2012 elections, and they had a supermajority for the last 4 years or so, which means they could override governor's veto. So when we won when I say we, I mean the Democrats. Democrats won the governorship in 2016. Didn't matter. Republicans would just override his veto. So during this period, they've done a lot to really slash at a lot of the funding for our public universities and insist on them restructuring themselves to have more of a vocational orientation and less of this, what you might just call this rent-sinking academic orientation. And while they could probably, if they wanted, to completely shut down, because the state has complete control of the university system, they could totally shut down the gender studies departments and the related things. They haven't done that. I think they're afraid of what the political fallout would be, but there's been a push toward that, and a lot of conservators are saying, yeah, college is about helping you get a job. And when you look at a lot of these professors who don't really seem to be coming up with anything useful, so you might say that about the classics department. To some extent, we want to keep the classics alive and have people taught about it because it's a major part of our history and culture.
Of course.
Jordan Peterson often talks about the importance of, we'll say, biblical archetypes in the development of Western cultures and ideas. But you could also say the same, I think, about especially Greco-Roman pagan archetypes and concepts and doctrines. Right. And then, of course, there's the direct philosophy. We're getting away from the mythologies. Just Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Those things are also important. And then there are, of course, the old historians, people like Herodotus, who had varying degrees of accuracy in his writings, and then people like Tacitus. These are all, in some way, a part of the classics, even though the classics tend to be a little more focused on the stories.
Right. I mean, and the stories and really like studying the language and getting good at reading Latin and Greek.
Right.
Like that's
then
the
we
main
can read Tacitus. Yeah. So there's always some importance in this, but it might well be stated that there's perhaps some glut in things like this,
Mm-hmm.
and coming at the expense of the taxpayer. And so it seems to me that in this culture, where especially where Republicans have won control a lot of state governments, and these public universities here in the United States tend to be funded by the states themselves because that's how we do education. In some ways, what we're seeing with this postmodernist wave in universities is kind of a survivalist against this movement, toward what is seen as an attack on university. That sounds like what you've said so far. Is that about accurate?
I mean, that's that probably is what it sounds like I've been saying. And I think that's largely true. It is a little bit of a defense mechanism. It's kind of along the same lines of what Peterson says about media, about traditional, and really Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, the great and glorious Hare himself, says, well, really our sense-making organs have suddenly failed to work, and because they're lessening in popularity, they are and this is really Peterson's point, they are increasing the edginess of their content and the polarization of their content. So I think a similar thing is happening as a defense mechanism in the same way that the news channels are doing this in academia. But another thing too is that this defense mechanism, it's not just because of a cut in funding. It's not just because of this kind of writing themselves into a corner and not being able to back out of it. At the same time that these are happening, and really even before, honestly, the reason that things were written, that were able to write themselves into irrelevancy, and the reason that people were able to believe in the first place that you should cut down, what seems like one of the most fundamental tenets of America, right? The state-funded education, so that everyone who, ideally everyone in the country can have enough enough intellectual development to understand the ramifications of their votes, that and to understand that when politicians start decrying colleges and start saying that they're nothing but irrelevant thought factories, or they make your kids liberal, Mr. and Mrs. Nebraska, etc. South Dakota right now is coming out of a governorship that was notorious for just pooping all over universities' reputations and saying what we need to do is take all this money, take it and put it to tech schools because we need more plumbers and electricians, which we do. But but he was just playing into, it was this rent-seeking behavior playing into the culture that all of South Dakota is one of the reddest of states, and it's and so if you want your kids to remain God-fearing, coming back to work on the ranch or farm, red staters, you better not send them to that university over there, because they're going to turn into a goddamn liberal or something. So but here's the thing. Really, I think that it happened a bit earlier than this. And I don't know when it happened. It might have happened, in a population boom. It might have happened because of some other historical event. But what happened regardless was that people lost the understanding of the importance of education itself in an absolute sense. And that happened far earlier than folks, I think, realize. It's not just, like the 80s and 90s Beavis and Butthead, Bart Simpson phenomenon of school is stupid, I hate it, I'm too cool for it, whatever, it's not fun, etc. All of that is a symptom of the loss of understanding why you study history, classics, philosophy, anthropology, the past, etc. And how you can learn from it, and how important it is to understand these things, where you came from as a nation, as a culture, as a hemisphere, as a globe, etc. And interestingly enough, this touches a little bit on what I'm writing my thesis on, and that I don't need to go into that in detail, but a lot of it seems to be tied to a difference in teacher education that took place in the 1890s and 1900s, to the point where the teachers, by the 1930s, you had teachers in the public schools who were teaching a certain thing, and by the time that all of that ideology had and that approach to education had become the mainstream approach, you saw this incredibly precipitous decline in reading ability, in literacy among students nationwide, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of of any number of demographic traits. And so there has simply been a loss of, to use Peterson-esque language, the substrate that this country has relied on for years, and that really, not just the country, but Western Enlightenment civilization has relied on for hundreds and hundreds of years. That, this general base of knowledge, this general understanding of why we're learning what we're learning, and of how we've gotten to place, and how we can, using the starting point, we can move forward into, eternity, etc. And this is something that really, one of the earliest things I heard from Peterson that really, really piqued my interest was that he said, we have lost this fundamental religion, substrate of beliefs, of trust in religious experiences or whatnot, which is why he's always talking about, the psychological significance of the biblical stories, and which are really only relevant because they also have an incredible amount of similarity to Greek and Roman mythology, to, the stories that have been spun over time and time again, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Iliad, to the Odyssey, to the Aeneid, to Beowulf, to any amount of Renaissance literature moving forward from there, Moby Dick, the Beats, etc. And then all of a sudden we've, throughout that whole time, whether deliberate or not, we've lost this general understanding of why it is important to understand where we came from. And right now the reaction against, studying anything about, in the classics or whatnot, is due to defense mechanisms and politicization of academia. And I don't think there's really any coming back from it, except by totally changing the system of education we have now.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about things occurring at the macro level.
Mm-hmm.
You're a graduate student. I'd like to know if you have any personal, direct, anecdotal observations from what you have experienced as a graduate student that you think are emblematic of the things we've discussed.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I honestly, I had a job interview yesterday. Well, kind of an interview at a school, and he asked me a very similar question. And the answer is yes, in the manners that you might think, this would have happened, but not to the degree of intensity, I suppose, that it did. So there is a lot of, being this outspoken, alternatively educated, like pretty devout Catholic in an English department in a backwater, like backwaters, mean maybe just a somewhat more minor state university. There's plenty of kind of looks and references and comments made during class, kind of the anti-conservative or anti, most of the time it's just, people poking fun at Trump because, really who's going to agree that Trump is an ideal situation for this country? And so, but of course, there's just a lot of, jabs or comments or whatnot. A lot of it was just simple, kind of condescension that is easy to brush off. But the thing is, I was fortunate, so there's not a lot of, persecution on my part, I suppose, for my beliefs or whatnot. Of course, that's because I also came into the university understanding, well, look, in these times we live in, friends, one must be careful and play things close to the chest. But at the same time, I'm not, particularly, radical or rabid in any beliefs. So there wasn't a lot of, opportunity for that anyway. But here's the thing. What really has driven Peterson's, kind of overall message about academia home for me has not been my experience in grad school, but my wife's. And my wife is studying counseling. And there's degrees of counseling. There's clinical counseling, which is more of the medical side of things, mental health treatment, etc. There's school counseling, which is helping elementary, middle, primary and secondary education students through their things. There's career counseling, which is secondary and post-secondary education, helping people understand how they can take their academic background and their personality and put it into a career. There's also marriage and family counseling, with marriage therapy, couples therapy, etc. But the thing is, the Department of Counseling, save for a few professors at this university where my wife is studying, is it's almost as though Peterson was describing this very department. When he talks about radical feminism, we talk about left-wing, social constructionism. When he talks about, postmodernism as a guise for, as a guise or justification for believing in Marxism, etc. And to the point where not only do you have a female-dominated graduate program, like students-wise, I think there are only 2 male students in the whole program of any kind of counseling track, and there's formerly a tacit understanding, but now as expressed in class by one of my wife's professors, that if any of the professors in this department or in other, or any counselors on a accrediting or a licensing or certification board or program in any university or any organization throughout the country, if they were to find out that you, for example, did not, kind of toe really the party line, or if you did not believe in a lot of these more, values-based rather than science-based concepts, like, gender being a social construction 100%, like the number of genders or sexes, etc. That whole controversy about transgenderism, but also this whole controversy about, LGBT communities. And if you basically were allowed to, or rather, if you as a counselor, either as a student of counseling or as a counselor yourself, allowed your religious beliefs to get in the way of, or not even to get in the way of, to contradict what what these counseling texts or rules or precepts state you should do and you should believe, then you are subject for expulsion, basically. The way that they talked about it with the students was, if we find out that you, not in so few words, but if it is discovered that you do not support, for example, like a homosexual lifestyle because of your religion, then you will be placed on academic probation and given remedial courses and re-education until you have convinced people that you're in support of this lifestyle, that you do not hold any ideological opposition to it, and that you are, that you have no problem counseling such people.
So let me get this straight.
Mm-hmm.
If this is true, even if you're on the path of saying maybe being more of a career counselor,
mm-hmm.
if they found out from maybe a comment on a Facebook post from like 3 years ago, where you say, well, the Bible, it says homosexuality is a sin.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody saw that, that person who's trying to become a career counselor would be on academic probation?
I mean, from what I understand, yes. I think there's a little bit too much paranoia about people going through all of your social media posts. I think that might be that might be an internet user's only belief, so to speak. But the thing is, but let's use a slightly different example. If you made a comment to a friend in the hallway after a class and your professor heard it, or someone heard it and told a professor that you did not, that either you believe not necessarily that homosexuality is a sin, but that you are not in support of, that lifestyle, not in the sense of, they shouldn't be married, etc., but rather that, you have different, preferences or beliefs on, on perhaps, the nature of the family, and the differences, the differences between a two parents, two gender family versus a 2-parent, same gender family, or a 1-parent family. If it was discovered that you had one of these beliefs, then yes, you'd be put on academic probation and as a student, and given remedial courses, and disallowed from graduating if these remedial courses do not do something. At the same time, if this belief is expressed in a paper or in a homework assignment, the same thing. As far as in the professional world, and yes, and this is also for any counseling, because this was in classes that all counseling students were required to take. This is one of the general education classes. If you are working as a counselor, then if you have this kind of complaint submitted against you and certain ethics committee, and you have to answer to an ethics committee or some kind of oversight board, then you can 100% be uncertified, decertified, I'm not sure, you can lose your license basically. And it was really that. It was that, that anecdote, from, that my wife related to me, on top of all the content of her textbooks and the assignments she had to do. She had to take, for example, that Harvard implicit assumptions test, 3 times or more, write papers and responses to her results, respond to her results, etc. And so it was 100% clear to her from the beginning that if she, stepped out of line in certain ways, she could lose her chance at her master's degree.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me that rather than affirm that a problematic belief is interfering with the quality of your scholarship or work, they're just going to make the assumption and pounce on you over that. So the reason I brought up the career counseling is I can kind of see maybe if you're doing like if your counseling is more on the therapeutic side, why not agreeing with a homosexual lifestyle could be a bit of a red flag, because I mean, I for one would not want someone who is homosexual going to a therapist who thinks their way of life is wrong, because I think it would be hard to parse good advice from that. But if you're just going there for career counseling, I doubt your sexual orientation would often be mentioned in such a context. And even if it were, I don't know how it would affect the kind of useful advice a counselor could give if they're just trying to help you find a job. And I think we're at a point now where it's very unlikely, especially a conservative who would be interested in counseling, would actively try to sabotage someone career-wise just because they're gay. I think if there's at least one good victory the liberals have had in the culture wars, is that conservatives, by and large, are not like that anymore, depending on how much they were like that in the past.
Yeah,
I think the problem now is with the culture wars, though, is that there is the resting assumption that conservatives are like that. Most conservatives I know, and I see talk about things. I mean, you look at Ben Shapiro. It's like, well, I won't go to your anniversary party because to Dave Rubin. He says that because I don't think homosexuality is right, but I'm not going to stop being your friend. I'm not going to deny you essentially the opportunity to profit off of my name when I appear on your show. He's really the face, I think, of 21st century conservatism, at least in that aspect. And we're not seeing, I think, that fair assumption of actual tolerance. There's this idea that if you don't agree with homosexuality, you're intolerant. Now, what's interesting is I had a course on tolerance when I went to Carolina my last year. And it was interesting because so this was also the year that a lot of this crazy activist politics started taking over the universities. But the course itself was in many ways a refutation of that. The professor could not have been more balanced in the way he presented political philosophies on tolerance from the left, the right, and the center. And one thing he talked about, there's these two competing ideas of tolerance in this course. And one is that tolerance means you have to support people, whatever they are, or however they are. You should just support people who are different from you. The other idea was tolerance is quite a literal term. You are tolerating people, which means you are enduring them. You are putting up with them, even though it may be a problem for you. So they talk about the Dutch Republic in the 17th and 18th centuries, how it was one of the first truly tolerant European societies. This was a Europe that was still very much religiously divided, with not only Catholicism and Protestantism, but within that, different sects of Protestantism. So Calvinism, Anglicanism, Lutheranism, and then even there were the Jewish communities. So there were those things. And how in the Dutch Republic, that was the first European society where all of those groups could live in the same town, maybe not the same neighborhood, but in the same town, and have the same political rights. And it's not said that these groups necessarily liked each other, but they tolerated each other. They said, okay, I'm not going to go out with a mob and kill you over this. And I'm not going to try and have the government come after you either with my if my faction gains power or something. They just said, we're going to live next to each other. We're going to disagree, and it's more important that we do that and go to trade and make our way in this world. So there's that idea of tolerance. Now that seems to me to be the really important kind of tolerance that we mean. You can't make people like each other. You can't make people support each other. But you can make people put up with each other. I mean, the vast majority of people you meet will not like you, and you won't like them. You're only going to click with the right sorts of people. And if you have unusual personality traits, that becomes the case to a power of 10. And
yes,
so,
indeed,
we can't make people like each other. We can't make people support each other. Moreover, even among people who are, we'll say, statistically normal in terms of intelligence, personality traits, there's going to be so much variance in where they fall on issues. Like if you look at the people in the post, I doubt they agree on every single ideological question you could ask.
Yeah,
there's probably 5% disagreement. The 95% where they agree can be pretty bad, but to some extent they have to put up with each other too. Some people, some of these postmodernists might disagree about how far, say, something like feminism should go, and how radical it could be. One might be radical, the other might be super radical. Does the super radical person then have to support the less radical person to be tolerant, or maybe they just put up with it? Like, well, this person isn't going as far as I want. I have to deal with that. You could just even look at it in a more social context, right? If someone doesn't want to date you, you have to tolerate that. You can't become tolerant by just saying yes to everyone who asks you out and such. I mean, that's, I think if we
I mean, that's similar to the whole, like, the nice guy reaction, so to speak, is saying, oh, you don't want to date me, then you're a terrible person.
Right. And so this heuristic, it seems, is plainly obvious in certain social norms, and it seems to me that we're for some reason failing to apply it to a lot of our ideological and intellectual norms. So there's this idea that if you hold a belief that defines you as an intolerant person, and people will assume your motives and put words in your mouth that you want to come after this group. Oh, you don't agree with the homosexual lifestyle? Well, then you're actually trying to harm homosexuals. Well, no.
Right.
A lot of these people who don't agree with homosexuality on a moral basis are perfectly okay to think it. Maybe they'll teach their children this as they raise them, but they're not. Things like the anti laws, which were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2003, because I think Georgia and Texas had some of those on the books until the Supreme Court threw them out.
Yeah.
Things like that, while we should always be cautious against them, are largely a thing in the past. There's been, on the topic of homosexuality, over the last 15, 20 years, America culturally has really shifted. I mean, you might notice that conservatives are no longer rallying around issues like, let's ban same-sex marriage.
Right.
That's very interesting to me, because that was such a definitive wedge issue in, say, 2004 elections.
Mm-hmm.
But now, people aren't really thinking about that, and I imagine that's here to stay. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the segregation of schools. That was a major issue in the 50s and 60s. That was informing how people voted. Nobody's voting based on where someone stands on segregation now. People accepted racial integration as a fact of life, and I think we're at a point now where people have accepted same-sex marriage as a fact of life, and they and then other things like the fact that homosexuals are going to do more than marriage and have gay sex and date each other and hold hands in public. A lot of conservatives have they have resigned themselves to that fact, you might say, which is to say they're being tolerant. They're accepting it. They're not running on it. What did they ran on some other things the last couple elections. They ran on things like Obamacare, on immigration, to some extent on things like ISIS and radical Islam.
Yeah, and there's always also, of course, lip service to gun control and pro-life, etc.
but compared to 2004, the focus on homosexuality, it's almost disappeared from the conservative agenda, and that is profound to me. But I'm focusing too much on homosexuality. There are other things where they could look at you and say, "Oh, that's a red flag," and sabotage your career over it. And
right. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of these. So a couple things. Were you leading up to a question there? If not, there are a couple things I want to touch on.
There is one question I've had in mind.
Yeah.
So, and this is sort of me. This is a progressive solution that I imagine to what I think is a regressive problem. So I think we're talking about things done by the regressive left here. So there's been this growing movement. You might say it's been in tandem with far leftism, but I think this is maybe one of the more optimistic examples. There's been a movement toward organizing graduate students into unions, in the same vein as you would imagine a workers' union. And much of this is the fact that graduate students do, in addition to having to do a lot of their own studying, have to do a lot of actual labor. You're teaching the undergraduate students, for example.
Oh yeah.
Doing a lot of research support for the professors, and they do this without pay. And in the current socioeconomic times, this is a very difficult situation for graduates, and they need that graduate degree in order to have, in many ways, a good career. So, one thing that's true of college is that if you get your graduate degree, master's or PhD, even if it's a less in-demand field, that will open a lot of doors for you that an undergraduate degree won't. So it seems to me that the real tipping point has been whether or not a four-year degree is the gateway that it used to be. And it seems to me that it's not. But it seems to me graduate diplomas still offer that advantage. And so a lot of people have said, and you can make the argument that, well, they choose to do it. But at the same time, you could make the argument that people chose to work in dangerous factories in the 1870s. So, I think the idea I'm getting at here, there are. It seems to me that if we push for say something along the lines of workers' rights in a graduate student context, which I think there's a legitimate argument for, since there's work to be done. Do you think that could provide a kind of shield for graduate students, even though that seems like more of a left-leaning approach? It seems to me that and this is why we talk about the regressive left, because when they pursue certain goals so vehemently, they abandon a lot of their otherwise held values. So, and I think when we see this in sort of a social versus economic framing. So an example is trying to get people fired because they said something controversial, right? So this often happens with celebrities, right? Roseanne Barr. But we see this happen with ordinary people. Like I've seen things shared like, oh, this guy works at this restaurant. Make sure his employer knows he tweeted this. Now, I would think if you're really progressive, or if not progressive, at least on the left, you care about not weaponizing what they like to call late-stage capitalism, because that's what you're doing. You know that this is going to have a severe impact on their household, their any kids they have to take care of. Also, you can get back over something. The inability to compartmentalize conflicts and disagreements. One, that seems to be of intolerance, because again, if we look at the Dutch society in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were able to compartmentalize, right? I disagree with you on religion, but let's talk about the spice trade. Let's figure out something on that, right? And the fact that you're Jewish or the fact that you're Calvinist is not relevant in this moment. Seems to me the left is having a hard time doing that. The fact that you're conservative to them is not only important when you're talking about politics on Twitter, but it's relevant to where you're waiting tables. Even if you make sure never to discuss politics while at work or while within 100 feet of your place of work, there's this idea that these people are going to bring it into your workplace and get you fired, and they'll normally complain about how right to work laws have crushed unions. They'll normally complain about how minimum wage hasn't kept up. They'll normally complain about similar things that employers can do to workers with conservative motivations. But as soon as the shoe's on the other foot, as soon as you can destroy someone's ability to attain subsistence for liberal goals, they don't care about that standard anymore. So there's been some work I know at Carolina and other universities, many others, to help organize graduate students and make them into a union so that they can have better standards for what they're going through, because it's driving a lot of them into poverty. And again, we can say people chose to enter this career path, but I think if you're a guy like me, I like systems. I like to know that a system is good. A system provides good incentives. We need graduate students. We need this higher level intellectual base in our country to do certain jobs, and we need a certain amount of. I think if we're, I think punishing an entire generation with it for largely, I think just the results of previous generations in their decisions on the economy is just not a good step for us in the future. So yeah, we can say they made a personal choice, but let's also just not sabotage the system to be committed to individual responsibility is my idea. What do you think about organizing graduate students to allow certain protections from the left?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be something that would be difficult for them to argue against, considering it's usually how they see things. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, lots to touch on there. So for one thing, I think that the organization is good. I want to touch on a few things before we come back to that. I'm going to see if I can do this really quickly. First off, as far as anti-gay laws go, I think South Dakota is the only state with the law on the books specifically targeting the homosexual community, because there's a law that I believe is still in play. It might get, I'm not sure yet, but stating that gay couples cannot adopt, cannot go through, simply cannot adopt children in South Dakota. So that's just always interesting. And it seems to be, and from what I understand, from the lovely, always reliable source of the internet, that is the only anti-LGBT law on the books in the country. So lovely. But with the homosexuality thing being just less and less of a platform for conservatives to run on, I think that's a generational thing. I think that simply with social media, etc., you're right that people are simply more tolerant of that. I think because a lot of young people just don't care. They don't, they were not raised in a way in such a stringent, one man, one woman life, opinion set, I suppose. Next, I think that, on the question of tolerance, you're completely right that, for example, the Dutch society was actual tolerance, and the ability to compartmentalize has been entirely lost. And the idea that if you believe one thing that I disagree with, then you, for example, about gay people, about black people or whatnot. Well, I guess black people is a little bit different. But the point is, if there's a value-based disagreement, then that will color the entirety of your existence and of anything you do, think, or say. And therefore, this is a huge problem. And obviously, it's a very intolerant opinion, or a very intolerant stance on that. And it's based off on an assumption, I think, that comes from postmodernism, the idea that you have no kind of overarching truth. And so if something is true for me but not for thee, then in that case, there's no reason to think that this does not. Let me see if I can get this right. Because postmodernism, which obviously is, there's no department of postmodernism, right? It's just a way to look at things as saying there's no, rejecting grand narratives. If you understand that, a lot of people come to issues through the postmodernist lens, saying that, well, if you are thinking that, for example, for religious reasons or belief reasons, that homosexuality either is a sin or really is just a well, okay, if you're thinking of homosexuality as a sin, then maybe that is affecting other things. That's like, there's a little bit of merit to that. But then when it gets to the point that you're rejecting science in the name of, you're in the name of postmodernism, then it gets to be a problem. And what I mean is this. There's plenty of research out there that Jordan Peterson has alluded to, and tons of other people have as well, that say the most stable, families, at least at this point and throughout history, have been two-parent, two-gender families, like a mother, a father, etc. For whatever reason, that we can explore through research, that simply results in kids with more stable mental health, and it results in them being more successful in the future. A lot of that might be explained because of cultural pressure against those non-traditional family sets. Some of it does come from the fact that you have both the man and the woman, and these two, the masculinity and the femininity, teaching a child. There's bunches of different things. There's bunches of different factors. But the point is that is backed up by research at this point. And yet, when you have, there's a tendency, if you're among postmodern scholars, I should say, that to say, well, if you believe that the nuclear family, I suppose, is objectively better to run a family than objectively better way to structure a family than a gay couple's family. You're intolerant, you're a bigot, etc. Whereas this is something that's backed up by science, and it's certainly subject to change. But the thing is that it's used as kind of a code or a dog whistle for, oh, that means that they believe in all these other different things. So there's a huge amount of like uncharitable, wrongful assuming going on in just really society, but academia itself. You say that you believe one thing, and they think and the person who's listening to you thinks that they all of a sudden know every single one of your beliefs and say, oh, well, you probably believe this, etc. Growing in my own life, in my own discussions with people, I find this to be no more true than when discussing the issue of abortion. And it's weird to talk to people who think they know exactly what you're going to say, and then watch their reactions and their hesitance to accept what you're actually saying, that that contradicts basically the talking points they've learned to argue against.
Yeah.
So that's just, it's very weird. And I think that you're right that we need to compartmentalize things. So on the idea, now going to grad student unionization. For one thing, I need to read more about unions, because another thing that I was always raised by saying, well, public education is down the drain because of the teachers' unions and blah, 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 and all these Democrats. And it's like, oh my goodness. So I'm not super clear on, kind of the history of unions, I should say. But I 100% agree that grad students stand to benefit from having more organization, more mobilization to advocate for their own rights. But the thing is, it's not because, you have professors, abusing them, right? Sometimes you do. Terrible things happen. But you do find that, obviously, grad students, graduate often with much more school debt than an undergrad. And I completely agree and completely support and would defend the idea that the 4-year bachelor's degree is no longer the gateway to success that it once was. And that changed very quickly. Like in 20 years, that changed. And now, just going to college is not enough, because the college education has proved not to be good enough, writ large to produce hardworking, driven, aware, excellent at communicating people. It simply is not the case. And that has actually been observed since the 80s and has only increased in prevalence today. So grad school is only more of a necessity if you want to do academic work, or if you want to do high level work in a certain industry. You need to pretty much have more of a background and more training really in research, because it's not just that, oh, well, the students are all letting down the expectations, that the standards have simply fallen. And the work that you have to do in grad school used to be the work that you did in the last 2 years of your college education. The fact that I went to a private school and had to write a 40 to 50 page undergraduate thesis to graduate is much more rare than what it takes to graduate from a more I guess conventional or mainstream school. And whereas that did not used to be the case. And it's a matter of historical fact that education standards have fallen for a number of different reasons. Now, how this relates to grad students is that, well, obviously a lot of grad students are in there because they need to be there in order to fulfill, make enough money to support family or fulfill a certain, desire or for a career, etc. However, they are certainly, kind of not necessarily victimized, but definitely victims of problems in higher education relating to a lack of labor. It is crazy to see how universities increasingly each year, even at my own university, depend on adjuncts, depend on non-tenure faculty, depend on graduate students to do exactly what you're saying, teach things. And for my own program, it was, well, you had to teach one section. You had two options: either teach one section of freshman comp, right, composition 101, or teach one section and then spend 7 to 10 hours a week in a writing center on campus, tutoring people who sign up for appointments, come in and ask you to edit their papers in about an hour, which is a nigh impossible task. But you provide help as you're able. So that's one thing. So that's 20 hours. You pretty much have a part-time job working as an assistant, right, in this assistantship. And the other version is just you can teach 2 classes, but sometimes that's not even on the table because they need to because of funding issues. So, but the thing is, the way that grad students oftentimes the savvy ones, and really I think the savvy grad students, but also those who really are driven to be in grad school for a certain reason, will pursue assistantships, will pursue funded positions. Most of the time that means that, tax-wise, we are completely waived tuition, right? You have some kind of a waiver of tuition, which is either it takes away all of the cost or most of the cost. And it pays you, really a pittance. Like in my assistantship, I would get paid just around $10,000 after tax, or actually $10,000 pre-tax, after taxes, a little bit less than that. And so that over a 9-month period. So you're getting about $1,000 a month, barely enough to, live in a cheap, apartment, maybe with a roommate, maybe not. And, and exist on your parents' like health insurance and cell phone plan, et cetera, and make sure you walk to campus. Barely enough. So there's a strong argument to be made that schools are not providing, livable circumstances for graduate students across the country, probably across the world. However, oftentimes that is a matter of necessity, and simply because funds do not exist for that, or at least have not been allocated. And this, I think that grad student unions are a fantastic idea, and I wish I'd been more, aware of the efforts to start something like this at where I was, because I simply did not learn about it until this past semester. 2+ years into my career and into being a grad student, and really kind of trying to focus down and buckle down on writing a thesis. So, but the reason the union really should exist is because there's so great a lack, so dire a lack of oversight in academia. Going back to the black box example, people just believe it. Okay, send your kid to college, they'll come out with a degree, doesn't matter really what happens. Which really is one of the causes of this whole argument for campus rape culture. People don't really care what happens, and then it doesn't matter who you slept with, you're probably drunk anyway, blah 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 blah. It was one of the unfortunate circumstances. The other thing is that, well, people just believed that colleges were doing fine, and then all of a sudden you have all this administrative bloat. You have even though you're complaining about lack of funding, you also are not focusing at all on the academics and making sure you have high quality professors, making sure you have the ability to fund graduate students, making sure you have a class is worth the $1,000 per credit, per 3 credits or whatnot that undergrads are required to pay. Instead, you have all this resource allocation going to non-academic ventures, and I don't want to get onto we should just ban college sports rant. But the thing is, there is so little oversight in colleges that they need to do. That they get away with, eviscerating academic departments in order to focus on other parts of not just making a better college, but building a better brand. Because college is so much considered to be the gateway to a better life, to a higher salary, to advancing social classes, etc., moving up the social ladder. Because there is that inelastic commodity quality to college education, You then have administrators saying, well, look, to solve our funding issues, let's just, build a bunch of stuff, like take out loans, build a bunch of stuff, make sure that we can attract students to come here, and that way we can raise tuition, etc. So what happened as a result of this vocationalist trend in, kind of shift in education is that colleges started having to market themselves as experiences, not just as education. Mm-hmm. And that changed the financial priorities for any and every college. If you wanted to market your college like mine did on the idea that you have rigorous academics, there's really, really a small student size that is going to respond to that, which means you have to have, sky high tuitions. And it means that all of a sudden, so much of the administrative, effort and energy is on those marketing techniques and those those ways to attract students through, non-academic opportunities and amenities, etc. And therefore, you have this huge lopsided nature to universities, where the academics is like one small-ish part of the funding focus at a university. And this is also, of course, with the whole, humanities becoming suddenly more and more irrelevant, that it leads to all these different issues. So if grad students were to unionize and were to, be better about advocating for themselves and bringing light to the issues that they're facing, then we could potentially see a change in those funding choices and a curtailing of administrative bloat and a curtailing of, building a brand and focusing again, more and more and more on, providing training, providing education, providing the quality of development, both intellectually and with regards to your character and your work ethic, etc., that used to signify a college education. And so, but right now, there are many isolated pockets of grad student unions, and they just really aren't united yet in a common effort.
Okay, you made a very interesting series of observations there. So I was approaching it, I think, mine was far simpler and dumber in that.
Come on, give yourself some credit, man.
It's all relative, but.
Uh-oh.
And so, the way I approached it was, the graduate students could organize into unions, and while the financial side might be hard to resolve because that's part of it, the other things like just having rights in the workplace, not being persecuted by who is your boss in that context, mm-hmm. Would be a useful thing, so that if you had a professor or someone or an administrator who is doing something to threaten to put you in a situation like what you described is the case for these counselors that in your wife's experience, mm-hmm. You could go to the union and you'd have them to back you up, and the administration would be hesitant to do that because they know that if they persecute their graduate students will walk and the whole university just grinds to a halt, and they don't want that.
Right.
So that was the way I looked at it. But you sort of looked at it as when you also factor in the financial incentives and motivations, and how that would cause the universities to rethink their funding, budgeting. It would have an indirect effect in that a lot of what has enabled this is what it sounded like you were saying. Well, a lot of what has enabled these postmodernist types to get away with what they're doing is they've been given blank checks, and the introduction of a union into the equation would change the math and the budgeting sufficiently that these blank checks might not necessarily be available to the postmodernist types, and with less funds comes less power and priority, and suddenly you'd see a lot of these persecutorial practices disappear. That seems to me like how you were approaching it. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I'm not. I'm a little bit hesitant to characterize it as you throw money at the issue and suddenly it's resolved. But I will say that there is certainly this aspect of if you fund things better, people will be less defensive, right?
Peterson has made this argument. He's often said one way to cure postmodernism would be to just double the salary of professors, and suddenly they wouldn't talk about privilege anymore.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that, that's not just, funding, which is also funny because he said, well, maybe one of the ways to sort out universities is to cut the funding by 25 or 50% and let the like everybody find out for themselves. Do kind of like a Joker from the Dark Knight saying, we have room for aggressive expansion, break a pool cue into, drop one end in front of three people and say, whoever comes out wins, and so there is some kind of logic to that, but at the same time, I very much think that so many of the problems related to academia really stem from the shift to having to focus primarily on financial choices, so that way the college can continue to persist. And I really think, as far as kind of apocalyptic predictions go, I very much think that by the time my children have when I start having kids, by the time my children get to the age of applying to colleges, higher education will look totally different because of the student debt bubble, etc.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's, colleges will close down. It's, I think people are a little bit, waking up to the fact that you shouldn't be going, probably not everybody who graduates should be going to college. The fact that 2/3 of high school graduates go to college and only 1/3 don't go to college probably should be flipped at the very least. That 1/3 should go to college because they really actually, desire to be there. And the other 2/3 should be able to find jobs that support themselves, well enough. And, so talk about the monolithic influence of a one kind, a single style of education has on, entire generations of kids is incredibly ominous. And the fact that we have $1.5 trillion, well, here's the thing: we have $1.5 trillion of student loan debt out right now, but $500 billion of that was accrued between 2003 and 2011, and then in 2012 and 13, I believe, or either one of those years, it broke the mark of $1 trillion, which means since 2013, $400 billion more in student loan debt has accrued, and this very, very quickly will. Some bubble will pop. I do not understand the niceties of the economics behind it, but something is going to happen.
Yes.
And especially with the incredibly aggressive nature of these
It's going to be very similar to what happened in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis.
Oh yeah.
And there's probably going to be other stuff with it. So I imagine the trade war stuff probably won't help either. So there's that as well. And then there's the fact that median income is still lower than it was before 2008.
Yes.
The number of people with full-time jobs, the percentage-wise, is still lower. The number of people generally in the workforce is lower than it was before 2008 still, even with all the jobs created. There's a lot more reason to be concerned, and so I wouldn't disagree there. But, one thing is just, as you're spelling this out, and it's similar observations I've had. A lot of what's happened now with university education, and again, I come from the archetypal university.
Right.
I don't know what you know about UNC, but it's one of those secondary universities that, at least here in North Carolina, just people have this elevated opinion of it, unless you're a Duke fan.
Well, I mean, yeah, but we can talk all we want
but
about Duke.
Then maybe part of why Carolina is such a perfect enemy to Duke is because it's so great and it's challenging Duke's greatness, you could say.
Yeah.
But I look at a lot of what's happened and the way things go. I look at how, this is going to sound horrible, but when I was at UNC, there were a lot of people, and I mean a lot, who I thought were just absolute idiots.
Yeah.
And this is Carolina. I mean, if you're going there, you're often in like the top 10% of your school.
Mm.
That's generally who went there. So you don't get into the top public university in the country by being a moron general. And yet there are a lot of people there who didn't strike very intelligent. And that sounds arrogant. I'm aware, but people would just make stupid life decisions there. People would do reckless, dangerous things, and then there was just there's just a lot of that trigger happy liberal stuff where they would speak something without even thinking about it. It was just clear they hadn't thought about it. They were just regurgitating something. There weren't a lot of actual abstract critical thinkers there. So in addition to just people being boorish and slovenly at times, which to a degree that you would not expect of intelligent, thoughtful people. There was also just, when they were in academic mode, they just didn't seem as on as they should be. And so I noticed that, and this is when I look back on that and I see a lot of the current discussion on universities, I can't help but wonder, maybe not everyone should go to university. Maybe that's not the right thing for the, or even for the students themselves. And maybe it's a sign of the failure of our system that we haven't found out a way as society has developed with technology and just the way the economy has risen and fallen. We haven't developed ways to maintain people going straight into the workforce and then finding livable careers.
Yeah.
And so you look at what happens with college. It seems like a big racket. And I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but the appearance it gives is that because if the students themselves don't suffer the debt, their parents often do, paying for them.
Right. But the thing is, as time goes on, what's going to happen is if the parents, if the students who then become parents can't resolve the debt, then their children will get it. And if they can't, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a huge, even though a degree is a promise of higher set of more finances later, even though there is that promise, which is really only conditional to the person and not to the degree itself. The idea that, and I love Jordan Peterson's characterization of this, the fact that universities have, and banks working together have figured out how to pick the pockets of the students, not only now, but in the future, and the past pockets of their parents as well, is legitimately a racket. Like, I am 100% there with you. It is related to the financial issues here. But of course, another thing too is, look, if you don't go to college, you might not be able to get into the workforce in any meaningful way, right? It's not just, oh, well, this is because I want to be an engineer. I want to go work for whatever. If you have a high school diploma, it means, jack all these days. And one of the things we haven't talked about here is how, yet, I suppose, and this is very much along the lines of what I'm writing my thesis on. So I still have a lot more to learn in this area, but it's how all of these problems, not only socially, but with academia itself, really stem back to the problems with the public education system, public schools, primary and secondary education in America. And for example, you're saying, well, look, these people don't strike me as, as intelligent enough, quote unquote, to be in college, right? Neither their thoughts, nor their statements, nor their actions. And however arrogant it might sound, there is objective, firm truth to that we are, and it's not that, oh, that's because all these kids are stupid. It's that there's a disconnect between academia, between colleges and universities, and the education and the intellectual ability that they expect of students coming into college, and the education that students receive growing up. There's an enormous, disconnect between these two. This is, it's a chasm of biblical proportions. It very much is. And I have seen this, time and time again, 25 students at a time for 2+ years, 2.5 years, as a teacher of one section of freshman writing. The inability to understand what an argument is, how to convince someone, what a credible versus a non-credible idea is, or credible versus non-credible source is, the inability to understand why something is convincing when you put it this way, why logic works the way it does, how these connections work in the first place, what logic even is, what arguing even is, etc., is completely lacking. And it's not just because everybody's an idiot these days. It's because the public education system in primary and secondary education has simply degraded and decomposed far more rapidly than the quality of academia. And if you want to talk about funding issues, if you want to talk about systemic problems with the system in education, trying to solve the problems in academia will only be a Band-Aid on a cannonball wound, a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, excuse me, to the problems that will already persist in students by the time they get to college because of the lack of, because of the serious errors in the way public education is set up, the way teachers are trained, the way teachers are treated and paid, the way that families interact with schools, the size of school, I mean, any number of things. But the point is, it's in all these problems that manifest in academia are simply, as far as I can tell, as far as I can extrapolate and triangulate from other people and from my own experience, they are all manifestations of a combination of problems that all originate elsewhere, every single one of them. And which means that if you can't solve academia without immediately expanding that project, 10, 100, 1,000-fold, and solving so many other issues with society writ large. You have to solve late stage capitalism. You have to solve failing public education. You have to solve political polarization and the lack of a knowledge substrate that helps people have a unified identity as a nation. Especially in a nation as weird as America, where it's not necessarily, if you want to talk about etymology, a nation, so to speak. A nation comes from this word, from the French, but then, from, Old French, going back from Old French into Latin, etc., which has to do with birth, right? We're coming up on Christmas, the nativity.
Right. I was just about to say that.
Exactly. Exactly. And so we don't have, this unifying principle of being tied to the land or tied to history, tied to each other through a shared history, shared, grievances, etc. If you want to learn about that, you go, talk to this lovely professor I had, Dr. Sarah Hernandez, about, the struggles of, the American Indians in American history. It is absolutely horrific what we've done to, American Indian culture, how much we have to gain from engaging with every single tribe as like on an individual basis, and learning what we can from them, about different ways of living, not necessarily ways of knowing. I think we've pretty much solidified what science is, etc. But, and one quick tangent on that, it's very unfortunate that, not unfortunate, but it's kind of morbidly ironic that as soon as we as Americans kind of like move through a huge continent and conquer a bunch of peoples, in line of history, which is not nothing, but largely characterized by conquering, the conquerors and the conquered. All of a sudden, we also have Enlightenment principles and people getting very, very angry that we're conquering other peoples. And it's a really sad irony. But the thing is, again, all these problems in academia are all manifestations of problems that originate elsewhere. And, and which is why I sincerely believe that academia as we know it will fail and will change in nature, because all of a sudden, since the .com bubble especially, but before then as well, society has simply changed at a pace people cannot at a pace so fast, so rapid, that it's not that we can't keep up, it's that we can't even recognize changes when we see them because they happen so quickly. And I'm in the business, so to speak, right? But my career is being a primary school and a high school teacher in alternative forms of education. And there is a huge generational gap, divide between the experiences the kids have today and that I even had compared to the experiences that their parents have, that my parents had, that probably your parents had as well. They're for the first time in history, life is so different in the space of one generation, of half a generation, that suddenly the way things work, the way things were run, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, does not work to the point of spectacular failure for society now and for society in the future. And a major overhaul needs to happen. And I'm very, very tempted to continue this line of thinking and to start drawing more parallels between America being the new Rome and how this is simply we're in the dying throes of a republic, blah, 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 blah. But you can listen to Dan Carlin's lovely series about the death throes of the republic, the Roman Republic for that. It's, $10 on his site, and, it's 25 hours on how Rome was screwed and we're screwed too.
Yeah, it's just that's one thing I think is a good parallel to draw is whereas you can't quite say in Rome's situation that it was the result of something like technology. A lot of what we're seeing right now is technology driven. The instability and our inability to keep up. That wasn't quite the case with Rome, but it was, I'd say really more what it is that we have developed systems to accommodate new technology that have developed faster than we've been able to keep up with. We have systems that are out of our control now. Rome ran into the same thing. We have systems that kind of made sense with a more steady progression of science in, say, the 19th century and the early 20th century. And we had systems that were sort of easier to keep track with there, right? Things were improving, and faster they improved before, but not so fast that they outpaced the human attention span, even across a generation. We're beyond that point now. Rome had a similar thing. They had a good system that met their needs. It was a fairly hostile, savage system compared to modern times. We're talking about slavery,
right?
And we're talking about decimation of armies. We're talking about
genocide is a matter of yearly fact.
Yeah, right. Like taking over an area and then just strategically killing a certain tribe that didn't even go against you, just to let the other nearby tribes know, don't fuck with us.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, especially when we look at the model of slavery and land to soldiers, Rome got so big that was unsustainable. So that system grew beyond what the Romans could control, and it happened so quickly that the Romans couldn't keep up with it. And we're seeing a lot of similar trajectories happen with America. Technology, the growth of social media, and the system that it's developed, and the way our other pre-existing systems and institutions interact with it, it has spiraled out of control, and it's faster than we've been able to keep up with it. So when we look at something like social media, suddenly you just lose your job over a single Facebook status or a tweet, and it could be fairly innocuous. The meta discussion about your tweet. So we look at what happened with Brett Weinstein and the email he sent about the day of absence, right?
Mm-hmm.
The meta discussion created this caricature of him. He was this seething racist, and a lot of those people who were outside of his classroom chanting for him to be fired, and then later that week were stopping cars and trying to identify people to find him. A lot of those people had not even read his email.
Yeah.
And yet they just, and then there's, you apply that to just fake news, Russian trolls. There's this system that we can't control, and Facebook and related social media have proved a bizarre kryptonite to our democratic institutions. And there was a similar thing with Rome. It's just, they got to a point where we can't just keep giving land to soldiers because it's just, there's no more. And now we have to pay them. And then when the generals are the only ones who can pay them, that's who the soldiers are loyal to. And
right.
And I think the one thing that we have to worry about is at what point will the shifting of loyalty. Part of what allowed the Roman Republic, with all of its novelties at the time, to sustain as long as it did, is it had this very strong culture, this commonality.
Yeah.
When the generals could start paying their soldiers, commonality began to disappear. Factionalism became more important. Are you with the optimates, or are you with the populares, right?
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Are you with Caesar or are you with Pompey, right?
Yeah.
Those were the questions. And it wasn't so much, are you with Rome? I mean, there was always factionalism. Let's make no mistake, right? I mean, there are elections. People take sides and vote a certain way. But the fact that they could give dictatorship to someone, and then for a long time, dictator would relinquish the power, really spoke to something. There was a common Rome in this. And that started, and that allowed the emergence of, well, the end of their rudimentary democracy and the rise of a dictatorship under Augustus.
Yeah.
And one has to worry: could we have similar systemic issues where things get out of our control? We're seeing a similar erosion of commonality of a consistent Americanness right now. Right. So there's
Right.
There's the alt-right, which has a more old world way of looking at it.
I mean, it's not even old world, man. It's straight up, the alt-right's, I think, main issue is that they conflate whiteness with Westernness.
Right.
And it's so absurd. It's so absurd.
So we'll say old world with an extra dose of toxicity.
Yeah, it's just it's saying old world values. It's really just toxic ethno-nationalism.
Right. And then you have that kind of on the left, you have postmodernists, but often I find what is true of postmodernists is there's a kind of ethno-nationalism to it as well, but for non-whites. And I think the only reason they don't actively advocate for things like ethno-states, like you see in certain sections of the alt-right, is that they're not a majority. They know they're not a majority. You're not going to insist that you have priority or special rights to a polity if you're not the majority. But I do wonder, like, if they suddenly became the majority. If let's say African Americans suddenly became 50% plus one of the population, I imagine a lot of the more postmodernist variety from that ethnic group would become ethno-nationalists.
Yeah, the radical ones certainly would.
Anyway, but some of them it's less obviously so. But you either have ethno-nationalism or a sort of proto-ethno-nationalism, and there's no longer this concept of a common Americanness, right? So the alt-right, they don't want to, they don't, not even necessarily alt-right, but maybe just generally the far right. They have a far narrower idea of what Americanness is.
Yeah.
Than, we'll say, what has been the case for the last 2 to 3 decades. Because it took us a while. For most of American history, we have had a narrow sense. But coming out of the civil rights era, even though not all the inequalities were addressed, there was a dominant concept that was very universal in Americanness that emerged. Sort of like the universal concept of Romanness that existed in the heyday of the Republic. And then the far left, they're sort of responding with their own proto-ethno-nationalism. There's the idea that, well, white people can't understand our experiences. They just can't. It's not possible. So it's a non-starter to expect a white person to understand. So there's this idea that just, and they don't just apply that to white versus black or white versus Latin. They do it for male and female and straight and gay and all that stuff. You can't understand these experiences. And the idea is that there's no common Americanness because there's no common truth. And this is where we're going back to what you've been saying the whole time. It's just everyone has their own truth. Then that complicates things, right?
Yeah.
You can imagine in Roman times, certain legionnaires would say they had their own truth. Well, Caesar's favored by the gods. No, Pompey's favored by the gods. Well, fuck you.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of, that seems to be where we're getting now with some of our more 21st century ideas at work. And to what extent will this destabilize our republic? Now, it would be difficult, I think, for maybe the exact result to end where we end up under some sort of dictatorship. That would be hard to do. But I think the real thing is in Rome's situation, the emergence of dictatorship and the loss of their democracy was a form of catastrophic failure. There were other forms of catastrophic failure. So, for example, the Roman Republic might have disintegrated, and Roman families might have been divided, and you might have had where there was this unusually advanced society that, with its imperfections, was managing to push of human progress a little farther. It could have failed due to divisions, and then they're just torn up by war.
Yeah, well, look, you're right. There are other kinds of catastrophic failure. So Rome's catastrophic failure was that they elected a dictator, right, an emperor, who basically said everything was going to go on as before. I'm just going to be over here, kind of, you lead with military might and as an oversight committee, so to speak, right? And all of a sudden, the consul, the Senate, the consulship, the Senate, etc. It was all just puppets for what Augustus wanted to do. And so I think that that's because people were used to this dictatorship, but then things kind of broke down. This yearly, kind of rotating this dictatorship, things broke down, and so having one emperor, I think, was somewhat just a natural result of that. And I think that, so therefore, if we're thinking about what the catastrophic failure of America could be in a similar fashion, it would be more of the, in my opinion, a descent into factionalism. It would be the breaking apart at the seams. It would be, there's always the tearing of the American fabric, American society's fabric or whatnot. That those tears would finally, be complete, and you'd have, and perhaps this is just me projecting my particularly favorite kind of, apocalyptic literature or whatnot. But I think you would simply have a lot of these different smaller states all of a sudden form. You'd have the glorious Republic of Texas, for example, and then you'd have, the Commonwealth of New England, etc. I really think that the factionalism would take precedence. And I think that I want to bring this back to academia really quickly. I think that the reason factionalism has been able to rise is that we, as you said, this lack of shared American identity has fallen. And there's a great book about that. It's called The State of the American Mind. It's a compilation of essays by a bunch of different people. It was published in 2015, so I kind of would like a new one to come out soon because in the post-Trump era or whatnot. But it describes all these different ways that the American, that it is clear that the American identity no longer exists, a shared American identity. It's by Mark Bauerlein and Adam Bellow. Good stuff. Anyway, the thing is, I think what has allowed factionalism to take such precedence in politics, in society, these days, of course, accelerated by the internet, by social media, is simply no longer a firm grasp on the Constitution and on the Federalist Papers, etc. Basically on what American laws actually mean. We have low resolution ideas of democracy versus democratic republic versus democratic socialism. That's the socialist democracy, whatever. People don't really understand any of what these concepts are, and so they follow leaders. We are certainly in a potentially temporary, perhaps lethally permanent phase of following demagogues. Even if you educate yourself on politicians, stances, etc., people, the one who votes is the one who wins is the one who gets enough voters to follow them as though, in a religious sense. And it's what happened with Trump. It's what happened with Obama. It's what happened in different, maybe George Bush. I don't know. I think probably Bill Clinton. Definitely Ronald Reagan. It's happened for a while now, because people are don't really grasp a lot of the more kind of specific and more academic or intellectual or just particular tenets of American policy, American law, the Constitution, etc. And the thing is, it's not just that, but then there's also the lack of people to call out that, the hesitance of people who do know those things to call out people who do not understand those things. And this is where, I felt very bad that I had not paid more attention to Heather Heiden. before, like before maybe like a couple weeks ago, because in all the different discussions that Brent Weinstein has had with people about Evergreen, it was really her interview with Rebel Wisdom with David Fuller that showed, I think, the core tendency, or one of the core like failings on an individual basis that has led America to be where it is now, and that can be very lethal to any kind of country. And it is that lack of people who know better to say anything, or the failure of people who know better to say anything against what's going on. She talks about the cowardice of certain people at Evergreen to call out the folks who were doing, who were censoring Brett, etc. And it's kind of this, I wish it were less cliche, but really, I mean, these days we mold our lives in the image of movies. That's the name of an essay by Neil Gabler. It's a really good one. You should read it. But the thing is, it's like the Boondock Saints, starting premise, man. It's the fact that good people, that really evil succeeds when good people do nothing. They stand by, they look, they say, I don't need to bother with this, or it's okay, that's isolated, or it will take care of itself, and they don't do anything about it. And the thing is, we've seen the willingness to do something about it, quote unquote, just as a drive or as an action on the activist left, on the alt-right, on these people who gather and kind of foment popular uprisings, etc. But it's not because they're trying. It's not, and even though they're trying to be a corrective for perceived ill in society, they are trying to correct these things, on, let's put it this way, they're building the houses of their movements on sand, and they are not on a steady foundation, ideologically speaking. And the people who have the responsibility, not even the responsibility, the people who have the ability in general, the intellectual knowledge to call out the lack of rectitude, of correctness in any of these movements, simply have not made themselves a loud enough voice, which is why this IDW is so crazy. There's people disagree about everything between members of the IDWs. Let's all remember, Joe Rogan loves drugs, but he's very responsible. He also loves drugs, loves fighting and gladiator stuff, etc. And so there's a huge amount of it, whereas you also have Ben Shapiro, the Orthodox Jew. So there's a huge amount of variety. But the thing is, what unites these people is that they no longer want to be quiet in calling out what they see, to be like factually wrong with so much in society. And they're the only people who are making themselves loud enough to do it. And because of that, all of a sudden they have followings, they have people who study them, they have people who support them, who hate them. I have a group chat with someone who, anytime we bring up anybody, especially Jordan Peterson, he's just like, blah, 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 nonsense, blah, blah, mm-hmm. And it's incredible. And they're making people mad, they're making people uncomfortable, they're also making people happy, because they are giving, all of a sudden, volume to, yes, some of their own opinions, which are up for debate, but also volume to, a pushback against so many negative behaviors. That's how Sam Harris, got started. He said, look, are you kidding me? Let's look at all this religious fundamentalism and say, you can't, it might be better to take all of religion out of society forever in order to prevent that fundamentalist behavior. But of course, we're seeing really, man always searches for meaning, people who, the postmodernists, quote unquote, but, the grievance studies fellows like, James Lindsay and all of his friends have pointed out, have taken a religious bent, religious wording and phrasing, etc., and applied it to, activist politics, to the quote unquote social justice war, things like this. And the fundamentalist, and so it's not just religion, it's, some kind of human behavior to find meaning and to really act violently, or at least forcefully, on behalf of those beliefs. So, but the thing is, the IDW and Heather Heying, is really the best descriptor of how this happens in academia. But it's simply this group of people who are, relying on science, on, years of experience and study, et cetera, to say this is all wrong. And just, and I think that the factions that we find ourselves breaking down into are based on wrong ideas and concepts. And so if America fails, it will be because we have divided into factions. based on wrong ideals or concepts or facts or truths or whatnot. And we will be no better off, after this collapse than, the mess than the former disorganized mess that characterized Europe in the Middle Ages of duchies and baronships and etc. So, and I don't know how to reverse it, but hopefully, people with this IDW, in this IDW group can only gain steam, and similar groups of people can arise and say, we need to correct the factual errors in popular discourse. Otherwise,
right. And a big part of it is we don't have politicians who are willing to make that courageous stand. I mean, there's plenty of disincentive just from a professional's point of view, not to step up.
Right. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose your
the Weinsteins, Hying, Harris, they're all a bit unusual in that they're willing to make that step. Peterson as well. Shapiro was kind of always involved in media, so maybe that's not quite the same. But
Shapiro he grew up with a good network of contacts.
Right. That's the point there. It feels like the natural follow-up to what you said is we need to find people in political leadership who aren't going to pay lip service to these on the left or the right.
Yeah.
And we're so far seeing a failure. Like, can you name a political leader who's willing to call a spade a spade? I can't think of one. Not really.
Not to call every spade a spade, right? There are people who maybe tend a little bit more towards that. I'm not like a Ron Paul fan, but Rand Paul can say plenty of edgy things that are true. But the thing is, he's only a senator for that reason. Ben Sass is annoying, but he's only a senator for that reason. But I really think that, the success of America depends on, as you say, politicians who come into office who will be able to call a spade a spade.
And not because they're edgelords, but because
not because they're edgelords. Exactly.
And that's the problem why Rand Paul will just never be the leader that we need.
Yeah, exactly. The most ridiculous example of Rand Paul is how, he was in a bill that was an emergency funding bill for flood victims after Hurricane Sandy, I think. He was trying to shoe in some kind of thing, somewhere in the bill saying that, life starts at the moment of conception, and that's why we're providing this insurance bill. And Harry Reid went off on him on C-SPAN. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Don't try to play these little games. And that's why Rand Paul, fails to be that person.
Right. Yes. And that's basically it right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is one of the things I'm worried about, because I've mentioned that I'm a progressive. So just by me doing a podcast like this, I'm a progressive who's active in the Democratic. Just by doing a podcast like this, there's a tremendous potential that I'll be sabotaging pretty much what I've been doing my whole life since I was 14. Been very focused on my goals. So that's a concern. And I still have ambitions to run for elected office. And it's just this, I realize I am biased, and they've been repainted so that most of the results are snake eyes. And
oh boy.
And I can only imagine it's just if you're elected and you have it and you work so hard to get there, it is a tough ask to say, hey, lay it all on the line, put yourself at risk of getting primary, right? A lot of congressmen have the advantage of not having a district that's competitive against the other party. All right, so they get to stay in for years. That's why Nancy Pelosi is pretty secure, for example.
Right.
But to then say, well, tempt your base to primary you for the sake of integrity. It sounds good, but man, that's a hard thing to ask. You have step in front of a gun that may be loaded kind of question.
Yeah.
And not very many people are going to do that. I mean, in general, it sort of goes back to what Sam Harris says about useful lies and always treat a gun as if it's loaded, right? That's the natural logic at work there, because then you'll avoid shooting people or getting shot. And in some ways, we're seeing a comparable mechanism at work with how our political leaders work. But that needs to be the next step. I mean, I don't see this fixing. I mean, when we talk about issues of funding on universities, particularly the public ones, or even with private universities, in terms of who's eligible for for grants and scholarships from the government to be used to help pay for their stuff. How they structure themselves is important, right? I mean, if you get government money, even if you're a private institution, there are some standards that are expected of you.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like you can't. There's a lot less discrimination you can do, for example, if you get public funds.
Mm-hmm.
And other things. So this is only going to change unless we have leaders who have the courage to stand up and talk about it. I'm not seeing any. And as much as Bernie Sanders, and he's my favorite country right now, he's not quite that. He'll call a spade, at least as far as, hey, Democrats, why aren't you acting like real Democrats? Like FDR much? But as far as just virtually any issue outside of that, he's not doing it. I don't know if that's so much because he's afraid. It's just he's found his thing. That's his specialty, the socioeconomic stuff. I suspect he's probably not very interested.
Yeah, I mean,
But there are political leaders who are interested in these other issues, and they aren't speaking up.
Yeah, it's because you have too much to lose. If you're successful in politics, you're successful financially. Money in politics is the thing preventing America from being America. Lobbying efforts on any side, etc. The fact that even then, we can talk about propaganda machines by popular discourse. We can talk about how the left and the right is is actually a tiny segment on the political spectrum. And this whole time we're engaged in, probably just about war crimes in, several different countries, et cetera. And then, and the fact that, but really I think the main problem here is that we just don't have the educated we have too many citizens, and too few of them there are too many citizens who are uneducated as to, what politics really is. And, the concepts driving those. And you don't have an educated citizenry, you can't get elected on, an educated platform. You have an uneducated citizenry, you have to play popularity games to get elected. Mm-hmm. And which is why education is so, a reform education is really, one of the best ways to further this American project is, if you can give people a better idea of what in the world, all of these things you hear in the news means, then they won't just go to the person who will cut taxes, the person who looks like them, or the person who, disagrees with political correctness and says things that are interesting and funny on TV and makes fun of reporters, etc. But people don't have these realizations. They don't have these knowledge bases. And so if were there a politician to stand up on these educated platforms, probably wouldn't get elected anyway, because he simply or she simply would not appeal to a great enough number of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the problem. Well, anyway, this has all been wonderful. We're coming up, I think, on the end of our time here. I want you to just sort of maybe take the next 5 minutes to sum things up and make any final points that you thought needed to be addressed that weren't quite.
Certainly. Sure. Thank you. Academia is in peril, and it's mostly the fault of administrators, not of professors, administrators who exhibit rent-seeking behavior and professors who have too much to lose to speak up against them, or professors who are simply timid or uninterested in doing so because they're comfortable. The search, postmodernism is a useful term for political shorthand to describe such people who are, who worry about the short term, basically, not the long term, in a certain sense, as far as academia or politics goes. But the thing is, postmodernism is a huge, if you talk about the postmodernists, it's a huge umbrella group of people. And that umbrella group can be fractionated down to a very, very, very distinct level. And most of the time, the people who might fall under the postmodernists group have beliefs that actually go against this postmodernism thing. It's just a way to describe, a certain kind of philosophy that is combined today with American anti-intellectualism to get to the point where, it's fine. Everyone can be right. We all get participation trophies for writing our articles, and it's whatever. But a huge reason that academia has these problems is that there's a lack of oversight, and it is possible to establish oversight bodies that will will curtail negative behavior on university administrative boards without getting to a problem of infinite regression of who watches the Watchmen, etc. But even were we to do that, it would not solve the greater problems that really manifest from a lack in from a deficient system of public primary and secondary education. And the phenomenon really that or maybe the phenomena that are happening today that show up today of social activist politics and things like this, and all being driven by social media, shows I think a couple things. One, that, like we were saying, we have lost the sense of a shared American identity. Two, we have lost a shared, really maybe there's a corollary to one. We have lost identity because we have lost a shared content base. We have lost shared knowledge of what America really is and of what Western society is, etc. The way we can reclaim that is, sadly, probably by total overhauls of the system. And that needs to start, let's apply the rules here, right? Clean up your own room. That needs to start at the local level. Grassroots, movements can be incredibly powerful. It sucks that money, big money oppresses these movements and minimizes their effectiveness. But if we can get people to simply, focus on objective fact, right? And not have this idea that, well, whatever's good for you is good for you, whatever's good for me is good for me. Relativism, in most of its broad-based formats, is lethal to a shared national project like America is. And we need to rely on the fact that some things are right and some things are wrong. I don't know if some things are good or some things are bad, but at the very least, some things are right and wrong if we want to have this, this society. Plato lost the wars right when he died. The sophists have won. It's all about, relativism, et cetera, and has been for a long time. But if we want Enlightenment values, if we want liberal values, really, this democratic project, freedom of speech, individual, ability to move, et cetera, if we want all of that to persist, it needs to have, people need to simply be educating themselves, and that will, affect a long-term change in education, in academia, et cetera. And if that doesn't happen, and it'll be very hard for it to happen, I really, really think I might move to Costa Rica with my family when I start seeing death knells, just like you had a huge exodus of, Jewish people or conscientious German people pre-World War II, pre-Nazism. I very much think that we're at the end of something here, that that social justice, quote unquote, politics is a religious fervor, is doing the same thing as fundamentalist religions. And we need to take a serious look in the mirror. And last little thing will probably make my conservative friends angry. I think we need a lot of government regulation in the tech industry and regarding the internet.
Okay. Well, interesting point to end on. Yeah, so they'll get to be seething until the topic can be, I guess, approached again later on. Very, very nice closure there. But I want to thank you for coming today, Gus, and talking about what you've noticed from your perspective and your wife's perspective a bit about what's going on in academia. It's educational, and it's something to think about as we continue to try and solve the problems of today. So thanks for doing your part to contribute to that.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for having me on. I've tried to be precise in my speech. I hope I succeeded.
I think you did. All right. Well, I'll catch you in the sub. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, Joe. Have a good one.
Mm-hmm.